Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to do this. As I was pulling some of the material together, I realized that 6 years ago, almost to the day, I did a three-part um, presentation on vicarious trauma for RSTP for sponsorship agreement holder representatives. So unfortunately, we haven't solved all the problems since then, so it's still timely and still relevant. For those who don't know me, a few relevant facts. I was born in a refugee camp after World War II, came to Canada when I was 8 months old as a displaced person. My wife and I have been involved with refugee sponsorship since 1979. We've had refugees living with us in Ontario and Saskatchewan, and we've most recently moved to Vancouver. In Saskatchewan, I was also the refugee coordinator for the Anglican Diocese of Saskatoon. That was a volunteer position that I held for almost 30 years. And so I'm fairly deeply committed, not fairly, I'm deeply committed to refugee issues. And I also am a social worker by profession and have some experience in mental health. So it's kind of a nice fit to tackle some of these things and relate them specifically to refugees. The title of this is When Helping Hurts, and I kind of like that because at our core, we are helpers, we are carers, we are motivated by empathy, by social justice, by kindness, and those features make us vulnerable to taking on some of the pain that others experience. And so giving that some thought and starting to understand what some of the processes are that happen that transfer trauma from one person to another, and how we can help people who've experienced trauma, but also protect ourselves from taking on that trauma. An hour and a half isn't a lot of time to get into some of this stuff, so this is an overview. There are some resources that I forwarded to Sunit that hopefully will be available to you, that if you want to follow up some of these things, they'll be useful. But essentially, we're going to talk today mostly about vicarious trauma and how it impacts on the people that we care about, the people that we work with, and ourselves. Now, there are several similar kinds of concepts in the field. First of all, we should understand what trauma is, and we're going to tackle that fairly quickly. People also refer often to burnout, which is a parallel issue, but it doesn't require trauma. It's more of a long, sustained a period where we're losing energy slowly because of the conditions that we work in, that we run out of fuel, and in the end, we have no more capacity to be helpful, to be caring, and often we need time off, we need to make a change, and so on. It's often related to workplace conditions, but it's not connected specifically to any trauma. Compassion fatigue is similar. It involves us and the fact that we are in relationships that are often we're giving and giving and giving. And if we don't refuel, if we don't regenerate, if we don't care for ourselves sufficiently, then eventually our bucket is empty. So we have to continuously refill our bucket, and that will be very different for every different person who's on this call, because we have all different attitudes, biochemistry, personalities. So the things that we need to do individually to fill our bucket, everyone has to figure out what that is for themselves. There are lots of possibilities, lots of ideas. Hopefully they'll come up here, but it is a very individual process. Now, when we talk about trauma, trauma is a very specific thing, and it's dealt with in the psychiatric literature. It was actually some of the reasons, it involved some of the reasons that psychiatry ended up moving to a diagnostic process, which happened after the war, 1952. Because they were trying to figure out what was going on with people who experienced the war and came back badly damaged. I'm not talking about the physical injuries that they may have carried, but they were emotionally often, and still are, dysfunctional, have difficulty managing their lives, are subject to, are vulnerable to suicidal thinking, and sometimes do commit suicide, sometimes cannot get along with their families anymore, or have great difficulty because there's so much dynamic conflict internally that it's very difficult. So a trauma is, at one level, it's an event. At another level, it's a response to the event, the person's individual response to the event. The events that are considered traumatic are life-threatening or likely to cause injury. They produce feelings of terror, horror, helplessness, and they're threats to our psychological integrity. And all of us have resilience, some a little bit, some a lot. So we're all impacted differently, but the event to be considered traumatic has to be significant. And there are also very upsetting events that did not include fear or death or injury. And of course, there are events that happen to other people that we witnessed, that even though we didn't have the experience of the trauma, but we have been so overpowered by the damage it's done to others that we take on some of the symptoms of the trauma. And of course, early and severe childhood neglect is also traumatic, and we're learning more and more about the damage of abusive childhoods and so on. So in a traumatic situation, the person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. And the person's response involves this intense fear, helplessness, and horror. Children deal with these things differently, and but most people end up, as a result of the trauma, with recurrent and intrusive, distressing recollections of events, including images, thoughts. So these things are intrusive. They show up at night in dreams. They show up when people are triggered by something that reminds them, and it doesn't have to be anything harmful or threatening. It can be a smell, it can be a touch, it can be somebody becoming hostile to even somebody else, but it suddenly takes the person who has experienced the trauma right back to the traumatic event that they experienced, and all the symptoms come flooding back, or many of them. I mean, obviously, every single situation is different, but it's a very powerful thing. And I'm sorry, I think I've got this slide twice, so we'll move on. So with these intrusive recollections, people act as if they are in the experience again. Sometimes they're seeing and feeling the things that they saw or felt at the time. Sometimes they can talk about it, sometimes they can't. It's an intense psychological distress for people. And of course, then it's a tremendous stress on the people who are caring for the traumatized person. There are a lot of physiological reactivity upon exposure, and it's, again, it feels like the original trauma, even though it's happening in a safe place long after, and is not a traumatic event on itself. So people who have what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is one of the possible outcomes of people who've been traumatized, and many people who've been traumatized do have PTSD, and people often try to avoid those triggers by changing their lifestyle, staying out of certain activities, and so on. They try to numb themselves so that their thoughts and feelings are buried, and maybe there's some unconscious hope that will prevent them from falling back into that particular circumstance, but that's not really how things often work. It is usually better if people are able to confront the symptoms and work through them, usually with the help of a trained professional. Somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder, somebody who's experienced repeated or serious trauma, it's often not the kind of thing where a chat with a friend or colleague or somebody is going to be therapeutic. It might be calming, it might be helpful, but it again needs to be done very carefully, and we'll talk about that a little later. So it's not unusual for people, especially if you think about I mean, this is firefighters and first responders and people who are in service, in military service. It can be people who were part of a major environmental catastrophe, an earthquake. There are lots of things, but people often change as a result of it. They change their worldview to some extent, and that's of course what happens in vicarious trauma too. It's not just a few symptoms, it goes to the core of who we are, and people may change, have a substantial change in their personality and their activities and their behavior and so on. So PTSD also involves hyperarousal, and that often means difficulty falling or staying asleep, which does not help much, because sleep deprivation only contributes to further challenging symptoms and so on. Irritability or outbursts of anger. Sometimes the person doesn't know, him or herself, why they're reacting this way or what's happening. Difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, being very aware of surroundings, maybe becoming much more suspicious and cautious, and often there's a very exaggerated startle response. If you come up behind somebody and touch their shoulder, that can sometimes trigger all kinds of reactions, again, depending on where they're coming from, what their initial trauma was related to. So so in terms of individual response, our response will be impacted by our emotional ability to regulate our emotions, to manage our anxiety or obsessiveness or sort of faulty beliefs, and that requires some self-awareness. It will also depend to some extent about our fundamental vulnerability, which is sometimes related to genetics or related to our just our underlying personality and capacity to manage stressful events. But how we deal with our mood and sleep deprivation and other mental health issues, social isolation, often people who have experienced trauma and are suffering from PTSD particularly, will increase the behaviors that put them at risk and decrease the behaviors that are curative. So social isolation is one thing. People may just not want to engage with others, which feels protective to them, but actually makes them more vulnerable to challenges. It also has to do with how people operate interpersonally, their physical and medical conditions, their financial stresses, their work stresses, excessive demands. These kinds of stressors can again trigger various kinds of symptoms. And not everybody who has trauma in their history has had one event of trauma. Some people have had trauma after trauma. And of course, that has a cumulative effect and makes people more vulnerable. One of the things that we are genetically and biochemically evolution has prepared us for external threats. And so we have, when we feel threatened, whether the threat is real or imagined, we often have physical responses. And the physical responses prepare us for one of three ways of dealing with a threat. I mean, this goes back to predator-prey behavior in animals, and of course we are an animal, so we have some of the very same biochemistry. So those animals that are physically well protected and able to defend themselves very often go into fight mode. Others who are geared to speed and agility go into flight mode. How can I get away from this as quickly as possible? Those who don't have those kinds of defensive may go into freeze mode, which is how can I become invisible so that the threat won't see me, or, you know. And all of these responses end up being biochemical in nature inside of our body. So I'm going to see if I can get onto this little schematic that helps us to see that. Oh, please do this. Huh. No, it's not coming up. Anyway, it is a nice schematic if you can find it. it has a human body, and the different points where the biochemistry that contributes to fight, flight, freeze show up. So you can click on a little link that shows what's happening to your heart rate, or what's happening to your breathing, or what's happening to your thyroid, or your different hormones that will kick in to help you be responsive and therefore more safe. And I think it's a really helpful schematic. The challenge, of course, is if our body instinctively responds to fight, flight, freeze, that's a good thing if you're in a situation where there's a real threat, and you need to have your body in a very, very alert space, and your body's doing all of the right things to make that happen. It's less helpful when you're the external threat is that you are in a traffic jam, but to your body it feels like a threat, and so all of these things kick in, which are not helpful when you're sitting on the 401 and you can't move and you can't do anything. So again, we need to find ways to manage our fight flight responses, even though they can be helpful. One of the things that I always tell people is that one of the ways I try to manage some of those things is through progressive relaxation, which is a technique of discerning how your body processes stress, and then finding out where in your body, which muscle groups go tense on you, because that triggers the body into some of these fight flight responses, and then how to relax those parts of you so that you can come back to some kind of calm. Now, there are many ways in which people can help to manage those kinds of physiological responses. There's, of course, yoga, there's meditation, there's mindfulness, which is a very a newer variant of those calming things. And mindfulness has been demonstrated to be very helpful to people. But I happen to have learned progressive relaxation many years ago, and I still practice. And I usually practice when I'm in the dentist chair and when I'm in a traffic jam. But there are other times too when I don't do it on a regular basis, probably should or could, but I do. I certainly do it on occasion, and especially if I know I need it, or if I'm pretty sure I'm going to need it. So let's talk for a minute about refugees. Refugees, and none of this is new to any of you, I suspect. The refugee journey is a challenging journey. Refugees usually have been involved in some kind of war, conflict, imprisonment, torture, trauma, if not themselves, but witnessing other people being killed or maimed or tortured, or if you imagine the Syrian situation and the chemical attacks that have seriously harmed and killed children, and so on. These things have a great deal of power, and they do result in a lot of emotional responses. And the first and foremost, it's fear. Every refugee, by definition, has experienced significant fear. The UNHCR definition of a refugee is one who has a well-founded fear. So People are operating, depending on their circumstances, with a little bit of well-founded fear, a realistic, well-founded fear, or a fear that's almost constant, that's at a deep level, that's extremely powerful. The next stage in a refugee journey is, of course, to flee. And some people have the opportunity to flee. Some refugees have a place of safety they can go, or a country of asylum nearby. Unfortunately, refugees also face the fact that that more and more countries, even now, are not wanting to see refugees and are refusing refugees access to their safety, and so on. So that in itself generates an enormous amount of stress and raises the bar of traumatic damage. Refugees also experience massive losses. And again, every single refugee journey is different. Some are fairly straightforward and not too distressing, but most are quite distressing and last for quite a while, and some are extremely distressing and last interminably. But in the process of the flight, people lose their possessions, sometimes all their possessions. They lose family and friends. They lose their history. They lose hope. And that's a powerful piece. And that's why we so often struggle to give people some hope, because we know how important it is, but we also can't give them false hope, because that doesn't help them at all. So when we're making application for refugee sponsorship and those kinds of things, it is sometimes very painful when we know somebody is not going to be accepted, and how do we deal with that? How do we process it? And there again, that's where our empathy kicks in and hurts us, because we take on some of that pain. Refugees may have survivor guilt. How did I get away and others didn't? That's again, with the serious conflicts, that can be really a huge item. And one of the things that often also happens is people lose their dignity. They are, first of all, they often are not in a position where they can control anything, or they can't help themselves. They're entirely dependent on the kindness of others. And for many people, that is in itself a serious attack on the person psychologically. People who've been doctors, people who've taken care of others, have looked after their families all their lives, and suddenly can't affect any serious change in their circumstances. It's out of their control. And lacking control is, again, a powerful, powerful attack on our psyche. And that's why when we're dealing with people who have traumatic histories and who have PTSD and so on, control is one of the most important things that they are looking for. And they will often try to take control, and sometimes in ways that are difficult for us. But control is really, really important, and we'll talk again a little bit more about that later. So we've talked about trauma, we've talked about some of the things that go into the impact and post-traumatic stress and so on, but what is this vicarious trauma thing? Well, it's also been called secondary trauma or secondary traumatic stress disorder, but vicarious trauma describes the profound shift that people who are working with people who've been traumatized begin to absorb into themselves. Helpers notice that their fundamental beliefs about the world become altered, and some may slowly become less and less functional, maybe have not as much energy, maybe can't any longer provide the empathy that the people need because it becomes too painful, and so on. So vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is really the people who are once removed from the trauma but are experiencing the symptoms as if they had experienced the trauma. And it's a relatively new concept, but it is one that is taken very seriously these days. As I said, like fire people, police, first responders, a lot of those people, when I've been in training, there have been people from many different professions that have required some assistance with vicarious trauma. So trauma is generally a negative thing, and it does have some painful symptoms, and it also can have some long-term damage if it's not dealt with, and if people don't recognize that it's happening and don't get some help. But if you know anything about crisis theory has some very similar dynamics to vicarious trauma, in that when a crisis happens in our lives, we get overloaded and we cannot use the normal responses that we have to things because they're not working anymore. And so we start to deteriorate, and we deteriorate more and more until we kind of hit bottom. Now, that's a very negative thing. It's experienced negatively, it looks negative, and so on. However, what sometimes happens is once people kind of hit bottom and start to emerge from the crisis response, they have the capacity to develop better skills and more skills. And the result at the end, especially if they're getting the right kind of help and the right kind of circumstances emerge, it could be that they end up functioning at a higher level than the pre-crisis functioning. And that's what this little chart talks about, that the negative part is the vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. The neutral is that people can continue to muscle through and kind of get to the other end. The positive is that people can have vicarious resilience. They can have vicarious transformation. They can have compassion satisfaction. These are positive outcomes from this. So it doesn't have to be a kind of a psychological death sentence. It is a temporary circumstance that, if managed properly, can sometimes at least be recovered from, but sometimes it can actually end up with a higher level of functioning. So we need to keep that in mind so that we don't lose hope, and that we can continue to work on ensuring that that has a positive outcome. Now, helping refugees with trauma is a very delicate situation, and it's complicated by the fact that, of course, most of us in the sponsoring community, well, I mean, we come from various cultures, and so we have hopefully some clear understanding of cultural differences and some strategies for getting to know people's cultures and people's triggers and people's strengths and weaknesses and so on. But it is important that we get the training about trauma so that we can approach the refugees from a somewhat informed position rather than just our gut instinct. We don't, as a rule, people who are outside of the helping world and just running their lives often don't really know how to respond to these things at all. Now, most of us have had enough experience in helping that we've developed some good instincts, I think. Certainly the people I've met have. But it is important that we provide refugees with a sense of safety. That's the first piece. Letting them know that they're safe, encouraging them to approach their situation in a hopeful way, and that sort of they've arrived at a safe place and things will get increasingly better. Now, again, they may not accept that, they may not like that or hear it, but it is for many true. And some people will do that on their own. Some refugees won't need a whole lot of coaching or supporting kinds of stuff, but that should be our position mostly. And at the appropriate time, and I wish I could tell you what the appropriate time is, but you'll have to figure that out with each refugee. It would be helpful for them to be able to explore the traumatic events that they have experienced. The risk there, of course, is that just talking about it can trigger all kinds of things and set them back in their attempt to normalize their lives and so on. So you don't want to hound them or try to get them to talk because we think it's healthy to talk about things. While I agree it's generally healthy to talk about things, but timing is critical. When I was executive director of Family Service Saskatoon, we wanted to develop a program for refugee families so that the parents could recognize traumatic symptoms in children and help them to resolve that. And we had some weird name, but we ended up calling it Moving Forward because we didn't want to make it about trauma. Specifically, but that was our agenda. When people came to the sessions, they just wanted to talk about jobs and housing and getting on with their lives. And it really took quite a while before they were open and initiating conversations about trauma, their own and their children's. So we have to be very careful about timing, but it is, I think, important to periodically remind refugees that you are a safe person or your organization is a safe place for them when they are ready to start exploring those things. Because some people don't want to talk about their trauma because they're afraid they're going to traumatize others, and they may. Some people don't want to talk because they don't know whether they're going to be judged, and of course people don't always disclose everything at once. So watch for signs that refugees are feeling things that are perhaps not productive, and invite some questions, or you may have some questions that invite them to share some of that, but again, no pressure. And very non-directive questioning is best. You know, what were things like for you? How did you manage all of that stress? And questions like that also take away the negative element, like, wow, wasn't this horrible? And focuses a little bit more on the resilience. How did you manage? This is a very situation that you were in? What, you know, what skills, where did you learn them? How did you get to be this strong? Even if they're not feeling strong, that's going to perhaps help them to recognize that that they do have it in them to move forward, and so on. So again, if there is going to be a disclosure, make sure that they're feeling safe. Use active listening skills. Ensure them of confidentiality. And you'll have to work out with your sponsoring group which things you may need to share with others, and then prepare the refugees for the fact that some of the things you might need to share with their doctor or whatever. But safety and calmness and supportiveness is of course fundamental to all of this kind of work. If you see people getting agitated because they're losing control, it's again helpful to try to find out how they normally self-soothe. How do they get themselves settled down when they're starting to become frustrated or whatever? And of course, if the loss of control is about the control over specific events, so if somebody has a run-in with their landlord or something, and they're frustrated and angry, some of it might be to find out how to give them some control. Maybe take them to the rentalsman and give them the opportunity to complain about how they're being treated by the landlord, if that's the issue, or whatever. So any way that we can give them control is not only good for them in terms of settling, but it's also gives them some of their sense of self back and some of their self-concept back, because they've had so many losses, and some of that is just a sense of any kind of power. So the more we can give that to them, the better. It's helpful if we as organizations, whether we're sponsoring groups or SAHs or groups of 5 or even family members, is get to know the community resources that are available, and find out who you can refer to once people are ready, or who you can access to consult if you're feeling a little over your head or whatever. And of course, try not to do this alone. Often in sponsoring groups, 1 or 2 sponsors will develop a much closer relationship than some of the other group members, and then sometimes they end up taking on much more than is helpful in those circumstances, and try to contain it and try to be the one who is helping them. But it's better to find ways of sharing that. And even if you have someone within your organization, that if somebody does tell you something that's powerful and you need to share that you have a confidential relationship where you can do that. In social work, we do that with supervisors and so on, because clinical supervision is really important in social work, because we do take on a lot of burden from others, and if we can't deal with that ourselves, then we're not going to be helpful. So our supervisors are there to help us with our vicarious challenges. So our own personal response to vicarious trauma. First of all, we have to have self-awareness. We have to be able to look into ourselves honestly and say, what is driving me? What is going wrong here? Rather than covering up difficulty in functioning in a certain area, it's important for us to at least acknowledge it to ourselves, and then find where we can safely acknowledge it. And one of the things to be aware of is our own motivation. Do we have a savior complex or a rescue fantasy? And are we disappointing ourselves because we haven't been able to do magic with people? And or we may be disappointed that the people that we're trying to help aren't more appreciative, or giving us positive feedback. Or I mean, sometimes, very often they do, but sometimes they don't and can't, or whatever. We also have many personal attitudes that have judgment in them, and we need to explore those for ourselves so that we know that we don't impose our own ideals or ideas on other people. It's sometimes helpful to explore what other people's attitudes or what the refugees' attitudes are, so that we're kind of on the same page. But we need to be careful. We need to learn how to manage our emotions. That's called emotional regulation. And many people who have chronic problems have emotional dysregulation. They cannot, if they get upset, they remain upset. They can't bring themselves back to a baseline. These are called borderline, in psychiatry, borderline conditions, where people, it's been described as psychological hemophilia, emotional hemophilia. With hemophilia, if somebody gets cut and they bleed, there's no clotting mechanism, so they will continue to bleed until there's some intervention. With people in sort of these borderline states, when an emotion gets triggered, it will just continue and continue and continue, and they don't have the normal methods. I mean, we all get mad, but usually we can bring ourselves back through self-soothing and through other emotional mechanisms to a baseline where we can function again. But the road rage incidents are people who don't have emotional regulation capacity. They get angry, and the anger just builds and builds and builds, and they get aggressive and sometimes dangerous. So we need to develop self-concept, develop self-awareness about how we function, how we operate. And again, you don't have to do that alone. You can get feedback from other people. You can explore it even with a professional if you want to, or if that's helpful. But again, most of the people in this field are emotionally sound and managing their lives well and able to give to the refugees and so on. So again, our personal responses, we need to recognize changes in our mood, changes in our health, our levels of energy, our sense of humor, procrastinating. Of course, I'm a classic procrastinator anyway, so that's got nothing to do with trauma. One of my favorite letters to the editor in any news magazine was a letter in the 80s to Time magazine saying, "I couldn't wait another minute to thank you for the article on procrastination that you did in 1966. So procrastination is both a symptom and a personality type. Avoiding news, discussions about emotional topics. When we start getting avoidant, when we don't want to face the reality of what's out there, that's a sign. Unusual anger responses to issues and events that touch on the work of refugees. So our response to the anti-migration people, again, I'm not saying it's not appropriate to get angry and frustrated, but again, how we experience that and how we process it will give us information about how far we are off from our norm. So again, have colleagues that will give you feedback, or have people you can talk to about if you're starting to find that you're being affected in a way that's not comfortable, that's not helpful, that's painful, that's scary, get some support. One of the things that happens when people are tremendously stressed, or indeed when their trauma starts to insert itself again, is that people, rather than doing the things that are more healthy for us, we often do the things that are less healthy for us. So we might smoke or drink more, we might eat more compulsively, we might isolate ourselves, when in fact what we really need is more healthy eating, less smoking and drinking, more involvement with others, and so on. We end up having less balance between work and family issues. We tend maybe to work more and harder and neglect family, which is not only not fair to family, but it's not fair to ourselves, because we need family to help us manage our lives. The balance between serious and fun, again, the sense of humor is one of the first things to go. Social, being social versus being isolated, being creative versus being boring and routine, and then our spiritual, getting away from habits that nourish us spiritually, can also be a personal response. And these are all things we need to kind of keep an eye out for in ourselves to determine whether or not we're being impacted by this vicarious trauma. One of the things we have to do is to know what we can have control over and what we don't. It's helpful sometimes to chart your moods and your different responses and so on. Keeping a journal can be very helpful. Asking for feedback, as I said, and of course, ultimately, there are lots of professionals out there who can help with vicarious trauma. One of the major issues, both for people who are traumatized, but people who are secondarily traumatized, is our personal boundaries. Boundaries are the way in which we manage who is in our lives and to what extent and how that gets manifested. How much of ourselves do we give up and how much do we keep? How much do we share? How much do we keep private? How much time we spend with certain people, and how do we limit that time? Personal boundaries protect our psyche, protect ourselves, protect our sense of selves. But boundaries shift all the time. And some people are really good at managing boundaries, and some people are not very good at managing boundaries. People who are not very good at managing boundaries can be taken advantage of, can find themselves becoming resentful, even though they're, if somebody asks you something, that's an unreasonable request, and you say yes, that's a boundary violation, but it's one with permission. So we need to first of all look at why are the people asking us these unreasonable things, but also we need to look at why are we not setting a limit here? Why are we not saying no? Why are we not helping them to take on their own responsibility rather than sort of dumping it on us? So boundaries are an important piece of this work. So there are some definitions here about boundaries. In the interests of time, I'm not going to go through each of them. So Nina Brown has done some work and some good work on boundaries, and she talks about soft boundaries, where people merge with other people, and their boundaries are not clear, and so they can be taken advantage of. They can be manipulated. I used to do training for foster parents and other parents with a psychologist colleague of mine back in Ontario decades ago. And often people would talk about being manipulated by children. And my psychology colleague talked about manipulation being a receptive disorder. Yes, people will try to get you to do things that are in their interests, but the manipulation piece requires for you to agree, either through behavior or through an unwillingness to set a limit or maintain a boundary. Spongy boundaries is a little bit soft and rigid, and people, there's also a term called emotional contagion, is where we take on other people's emotions as opposed to having some control over our emotions. And people with spongy boundaries really have no clarity about what they need their boundaries to do and to be in order to remain safe and functional. So there are rigid boundaries and flexible boundaries, and flexible boundaries are considered to be kind of the ideal. They're similar to selective rigid boundaries, but the person has more control. So flexible boundaries are, you decide, depending on the circumstances, your capacity, your willingness, your interest in doing something or letting somebody in to your life or into your world in some way. And that you have the assertiveness and the emotional capacity to limit what you're prepared to take on. So one of the things about vicarious trauma that we should also be thoughtful of and mindful of is the fact that organizations also have some responses. Some manage vicarious trauma badly, and some manage it really well. And it depends on the nature of the organization, the culture of the organization, the leadership in the organization, and what they model. So hopefully organizations will have a culture of openness and supportiveness, a culture of collectivity. We're all in this, so we're not going to hang anyone out to dry. We're not going to push anyone off the cliff. That we're in there together. We'll problem solve together. We'll support one another. Where people, especially even senior people, model self-disclosure and self-awareness, so that people don't feel like they're going to be judged if they disclose that they are somehow losing it or reducing in functionality or whatever. Having regular open dialogue where people are invited to share some of their personal issues and challenges as well as joys and so on. So there are lots of ways to do that, but it requires leadership that is aware of and comfortable with an attitude of openness. So regular refreshers, retreats, recreation, ensuring that there's a acceptance in policy and practice of supporting people who are hurting. It's very easy for people, and especially people who are not in the helping profession. In a helping profession, hopefully this is kind of second nature, but still there are personalities that get very frustrated if somebody isn't pulling their load, even though their load is beyond their capacity in that moment, and they may forget that the person has been exceeding their requirement for some time, and now they're in a space where they need some support or some help or some time or something, and then people may get angry. I mean, in a healthy organizational environment, those things don't happen very much. So having support systems in place in agencies, as opposed to, I mean, many sponsors are not in an organization. They're sponsoring groups that are part of a parish or groups of 5 or whatever, so they don't have an organization necessarily to look out for them, but or who that has the capacity to have an EAP program or a consultant, mental health consultant available to them, and so on. But these are things larger organizations can do, settlement agencies and so on. And EAP programs are employee assistance program where the employer contributes or pays for a certain amount of counseling that's under contract with, and it's still, even though the organization is paying for it, it doesn't mean it's not confidential or protected. And of course, a lot of organizations don't have an EAP program, but they have good benefits that also allow people to see a psychologist or social worker or helper of some sort, professional helper. So also our organizations that are on top of this build self-care, open communication, and healthy boundaries into the culture of the organization. And they have a lot of resources that they use to do that. And we are not going to fix any of this, but we can always work on making it better for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our clients, if you will, if we want to see the refugees as clients. That's my social worker coming out in me. But if we continue to be aware, if we continue to challenge ourselves to be open and explore what's going on in the organization, in the lives of the people affected, we'll have a much better chance of keeping all of us as healthy and functional as is possible. So I think I'm going to end it here and open it up to questions.